Vayhi Bimay Achashvarosh. We're coming to the Chag of Purim, Kriyas Megillah, and Ala Nisim. We say Ala Nisim in the Tfilas, benching. And it's very interesting that Ala Nisim, and we start Bimay Mordechai V'Esther. And in the Megillah, when we begin the Kriyas Megillah, reading of the Megillah, we start Vayhi Bimay Achashvarosh. And why does the Megillah start with this introduction, Vayhi Bimay Achashvarosh? Why is that so important to know a little bit about the history of Achashvarosh and who he was and what he was? And he was ruled over 127 Medinas, how powerful he was, and why the change? Why in Ala Nisim we start Bimay Mordechai V'Esther? And the Megillah starts with this introduction to Achashvarosh, Vayhi Bimay Achashvarosh. And the Goyen asks Akasha, he says, this introduction, however, is delaying the description of the nace. And it delays the Megillah's telling us about the nace, and yet it's part of the Megillah, and we know that the halacha is that if someone omits part of the Megillah, he's not yaitza. So therefore, it will come out that if a person omits some part of this Vayhi Bimay Achashvarosh and this introduction about Achashvarosh, then he would not be yaitza the mitzvah Megillah. Why is this such an integral part of the Kriyas Megillah? One would think it's about the nace, and this introduction, so to speak, of Vayhi Bimay Achashvarosh, is part of the Megillah, and to the extent that it's so fundamental to the Megillah that if a person omits part of that, he's not yaitza the mitzvah Kriyas Megillah. Now, why is that so? Why is this such an essential part of the Megillah, of the Persume Nisa of the Nes of Purim? And why the difference between this and the Ala Nisim? The Gemara asks, Esther min atayr minayin. How do we know the Torah? How do we know in the Torah that there is a mitzvah of Kriyas Megillah? That's a mitzvah of Purim, Kriyas Megillah. Where do we see in the Torah that there is this Purim, this Chag of Purim? Esther min atayr minayin. Where do we see Esther? Where do we see Esther? The Esther Amalka. Where do we see a remez of this in the Torah? The Gemara answers because the Pasuk says, "Va'anoichi haster aster ponai." The Rabbi Shalom says that at the time when the Pana, the nation, will turn their heart away from me, I will conceal myself. Haster aster pana b'yemahu. I conceal my haster aster Esther. That's a remez to Esther. It seems to be an interesting play on words, but what does the fact that when Bnei Yisrael turn away from Hashem, Hashem conceals himself, what does that have to do with Esther, Esther Malka, and Purim? And furthermore, we know that Purim is a time of Kabbalah Sater. That Kimu v'Kiblu, Klal Yisrael Kimu v'Kiblu, they were Mekayim, they were Kabbal the Torah once again at the time of Purim, the Nes of Purim. They were Makabal the Torah in Har Sinai. But at Har Sinai, it was called from Har Kegigis. They were in a certain way coerced. Yes, they said Nasav and Ishma. But as Taisus and Masech Shabbos points out, that there was the fear that with all the koilos and barokim and all the trembling and all the trembling and fear of the Hashros, Hashchina, Matan Torah, and Har Sinai, the Klal Yisrael would perhaps back out, run away. Kaflim Har Kegiyas, the mountain was there, now came over them and covered them up. Didn't allow them to escape. So they were in a certain way coerced. Harder Kiblu and Meach, then they were Makabalet later Ma'ava. Harder Kiblu Me Achashvarosh Ma'ava. They were Makabal at the time of Achashvarosh Mahava. What do you mean at the time of Achashvarosh? They were Makabal at the time of Mordechai V'Esther Mahava. Yes, they were Makabal the Torah again, but attributing it in a certain way to Achashvarosh. He happened to be the king. He was the Rosh of the king. But why would we, in a certain way, attribute it to Achashvarosh? How did Kiblu Bimay Mordechai V'Esther? How did Kiblu Bimay Achashvarosh? They're makabel it again at the time of Achashvarosh. Look, the guy, he says, this Vayhi Bimay Achashvarosh is not an incidental thing. It's not a history, it's not a background to, a historical background to the events of Purim. That's not what is meant over here. This is a fundamental part of the Nes. It's an integral part of the Nes. Vayhi Bimay Achashvarosh. Vayhi Bimay Achashvarosh. It was at the time of Achashvarosh, at the time when Klal Yisrael was in a difficult situation, difficult straits. Achashvarosh was a powerful king. And Achashvarosh was a king that oppressed the Yidden. He was powerful. Achashvarosh ruled over 127 Medina Kush. He was a powerful king. Vayhi Bimay Achashvarosh. The Lashon Vayhi is the Lashon of Vayhi, of groaning, of tsar. It was a difficult time for the Yidden. It was a time of tsar. Vayhi Bimay Achashvarosh. It was a time of nehi, of groaning, of tsar, under this powerful king who oppressed them. It was a time of Hester Ponim, when the Ribbono Shel Olam concealed himself, when Klal Yisrael was downtrodden, where we didn't see the Yad Hashem and the glory of His nation. They were subjects and subjugated to this powerful ruler, Achashvarosh. It was a difficult time. It was a time of Hester Ponim. That's when the Nes of Purim occurred. It occurred in the context of Hester Ponim. Not like the Nisim of Yetzias Mitzrayim, which were Gilui Ponim, revealed miracles, the open hand, the Yad Hashem. This was a time of Hester Ponim. Esther Minater Minayin. Where do we see and how do we know that there will be a Nes, a great Nes, even in the time of Hester Ponim, when the Ribbono Shel Olam will conceal himself, when we will not see the Nisim Galuyim, but there will be a magnificent, incredible Nes, even in that context? V'anochi Aster Ponai. I will conceal myself, but I'll be there. But I'll be there for you, even though I'm concealed. And that's why Dafka in the Megillah, as opposed to the Al Nisim, where it relates to miracle, but in the Megillah, where it's Mefarsim, the Nes, and tells us what the Mahus, really what the essence of the Nes is Vayhi Bimay Achashvarosh. We have to understand that this Nes took place in the time of Hester Ponim. And it's in that context that this Nes occurred. And it's in that context where Kimu v'Kiblu HaYehudim, they're makabel the Torah again. How and why? Because they saw, even at the time of Hester Ponim, and the Ribbono Shel Olam was with them. They saw the Av of the Ribbono Shel Olam, that He takes care of them and protects them, even at the time of Hester Ponim, even at the time of punishment, even at the time of Tsar, but the Ribbono Shel Olam was there. That brought a kurva closeness to the Ribbono Shel Olam. They're makabel the Torah again. Bimay Achashvarosh. At the time of Achashvarosh, at the time of Hester Ponim, when they were under that rule, but they saw the Ribbono Shel Olam brings this great Nes, they're makabel ahava. They're makabel with ahava. At the time of Achashvarosh, specifically at that time, and the time of Tsar, at the time of difficulty, the time of Hester Ponim, and they saw this great Nes, and the Ribbono Shel Olam protected them and allowed them to overpower their enemies. Now they're makabel ma'ava. They have the ava of makabel the Torah. Bimay Achashvarosh, they're makabel the Torah ma'ava. This shows you what the essence of the Nes is. It's not just a historical description. And this is the Nes Nista of Purim, which was a catalyst for Kabbalah's Torah Mahava. And we see from here that there is a great closeness that we have to the Ribbono Shel Olam Nisim Galuyim. But sometimes when it's a time when we're fallen out of favor. Sometimes when it's a time of charonaf, and we see a closeness, a kurva, and the Yad Hashem, it can bring us even closer. Then we really see the depth of the Ava that the Rabbi Shalom has, because even when we're out of favor, when we've fallen from favor, and we see how much He loves us, that even has a potential sometimes to bring us even closer. And that's a lesson in human relationships, certainly in parents and children. And children respond to the Ava of their parents, and when they're behaving, when they're doing well, and when they're apple of their parents' eyes, and it brings them closer and motivates them to do the rotzon, the will of their parents. Sometimes, when they've fallen out of favor, when they're still good children, they've fallen out of favor, and it's a time perhaps of punishment, and they still see that the Ava of the parent and how much they care and how much they protect and how much they do, even in those times, sometimes that brings them even closer. And that's true for parents and children, it's true for all human relationships, that there's a time, sometimes when there's a time of Hester Purim, and there's a time of estrangement. But when there is a rotzon, and even in those times where there is giving and doing, it can even forge a closer relationship and a more lasting, permanent relationship. Kimu v'kiblu.